Here is Vinta Blue Floss. What an odd name. Now, before I even get going, I have to say that the text that you are seeing, I'm doing scare quotes at the moment, is going to be redone in another review because boy, oh boy, was this one hard. As you can see, this is a very unfortunate blue that is generally too light to use, making it frustrating to use. I didn't take any notes for this video with this because I prefer to be able to read my notes. I had to use a different ink for it. It isn't unreadable and does shade on all papers. So get that, isn't unreadable. In general, this is well behaved, I guess. And for the most part, it is consistent and tone across paper, I guess, if we want to, let's move on. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs as well or even better than it does on some of the better papers. I know. I see no need for a bottle of this or even another sample. And if you were to give me a bottle, I might consider you to be a mortal enemy well into the afterlife.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. So now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
This is, as I was saying, far too light for me to really be happy with. I can kind of see it, but if someone was turning work into me like this, or if I was looking back on stuff as you get older, I would be very upset with younger me looking at this. Far too light to really, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Thankfully, it shades some. I don't want to beat up on it too much, so I'm going to try and move a little bit faster so that I can really not hate on this ink through looking at the writing samples, but give you the opportunity to see it at least. Looking at the back of the page, not a surprise that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta. Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milli.
Here is Vinta Macopa. Here is Vinta Hannah. Here is Vinta La Union.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, a very light one, with no feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. Yes, it is still hard to read, but it is there. It does generally have good performance. This is not a for me, but some people really are going to enjoy these very light blues. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so if you must, you could write on the back.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we're getting on the page here is a very light turquoise. It turns just slightly turquoise over just being a blue itself. So there is some tone shift as a result of the tone of the paper, meaning this ink is a little bit more translucent. Not a horrible thing if that's what you were looking for. In fact, if you were using this to do some painting with, I think it could be very nice to be able to use with some blending. It does not feather. It does not spread. I think it's a little more readable on this paper. This, I think, is some of the most readable that we're going to get. It's very usable, but not optimal in this situation. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. You could continue writing your notes back here if you like those faded blue inks. So, but if you like those very light blues, go ahead and let me know in the comments.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Unfortunately, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have some shading, you can see it. Now, when it comes to the quad rule, it really fades into the background, letting that quad rule stand out as the prominent feature on the page, which to me is not a good thing if this is the type of paper you prefer to use. But if you like it together with this, then go for it. I'm not. Looking at the back of the page, to no surprise, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, so you could continue writing back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is KWZ Walk Over Vistula. Here is Noodler's Upper Ganges Blue. Here is Platinum Blue.
Here is Sailor Manyo Samir.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
I know it doesn't seem possible, but this is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does have moments of shading, thankfully, because if it wasn't for the shading, you might not even know that there was some writing here. I feel 100% confident it's going to look better on camera after processing than it does to me in person, but to me in person makes me want to remove my eyes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Pink. Here is Pelican Mandarin. Here is Diamine Claret.
Here is Sailor Studio 770.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Oh my God, that's bad. No feather, no spread. It does shade, which is good, but boy, oh boy, I think this is a good way to give a subtle note to somebody when you're dealing with it, because I am not sure that this is the way to, say, hey, look at this amazing work, but it might be a way to say, hey, consider making a correction here. Of course, they probably won't see it. Looking at the back of the page, just because I want to make sure it does show, it surprisingly, it gets deep into the page, which isn't the surprising part, but what we get is the non-ability to write on both sides of the page because of how deep into the paper this ink gets. Shocking considering how light it was, but it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Noodler's Nib Creeper has a wet nib, usually gives the darkest tone of the ink. Just to fuel more disappointment off camera, I tried this in a dry fine to hilariously horrific results. Only do that to your enemies. Send them important information written that way. After careful consideration and experimentation, I have found the perfect pen to bring out as much joy as can be squeezed out of this ink. That would be somebody else's pen, just not somebody you care about. As when you do this to someone, you have earned an enemy well into the afterlife.